We all like to think that we're important, that our lives make a difference, that people will notice us and miss us when we're gone, that our opinions matter. No one likes to be just another number. I heard a story once of a high school senior who was sending out applications to different colleges and decided to take a flyer on a prestigious college and filled out the application and put it in the mail. She was an average student, didn't have great grades, and wasn't particularly optimistic that she would be accepted to this particular college. On the application, there was a question about leadership ability, and she answered honestly and said, "None really. I'm applying because I want a good education." And so she was quite surprised when sometime later she received a personal phone call from the president of the university. And the president let her know that she was accepted into the college that she never expected to be able to access. And so in her surprise, she said, "Well, why are you accepting me? I really didn't think this would happen." And the president said, "Well, we've been going through all the applications we received, and we're looking to admit 4,689 freshmen next year. And as we looked at the applications, we saw that there were people that were ambitious, that wanted to be leaders in business and industry, that there were people aiming to be leaders in the military, in politics, aiming to be medical leaders and scientific leaders, and leaders in the world of education and academia." And he said, "And then we came to your application and we saw that you had zero leadership aspirations, and we decided you were a perfect fit because we needed at least someone on our campus who was willing to be a follower." Now, I don't know if that's, well, I do know. If you're a high school senior, don't rely on that answer getting you into college. I don't expect that would work, but in the story it did, and it makes a point that we tend to emphasize the need for leadership skills, but Jesus actually calls us to be followers. And so that really challenges us to re-envisage what it means to be a Christian, to reevaluate our priorities and our goals. I think the story describes our society. The internet makes it easy for us to search and find a piece of information that other people haven't found. And we decide that information is correct. And so we know something that no one else knows, and we hold it up and we wave it and we say, "Hey everybody, look over here. I've got the right answer. Come, follow me, listen to me, agree with me. I'm going to try and persuade you to come to see things in my way, because I don't want to view things in the way that everybody else does." And so we often promote the idea of unique ways of thinking. Don't follow the crowd. Don't be a sheep. Don't be lulled into a sense of security. Stand up for yourself. And so these values create a clash, and sometimes the people with the piece of information that nobody else has are just wrong. And so we need to be careful who we listen to and who we pay attention to. When Jesus delivers the Sermon on the Mount and he asks people to follow him, no doubt he received the same sort of pushback. "Why should we follow you? You're a carpenter from Galilee. What makes you think that you're better than my synagogue leaders or the other religious leaders at the temple in Jerusalem?" Or other people might simply have said, "I don't agree with you, Jesus. You're wrong." Like, "I know the Bible better than you do, Jesus, and you're wrong." There's always those people. And then there were some people that we know followed Jesus just because they wanted to be fed and because they were looking for the entertainment value of his healings and his miracles. And none of those were the people or the responses that Jesus was seeking and looking for from the crowds that he spoke to. And that brings us to today's text, which is Matthew chapter 7, starting in verse 13. Enter through the narrow gate. For wide is the gate and broad is the road that leads to destruction, and many enter through it. But small is the gate and narrow the road that leads to life, and only a few find it. Watch out for false prophets. They come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they are ferocious wolves. By their fruit you will recognize them. Do people pick grapes from thorn bushes or figs from thistles? Likewise, every good tree bears good fruit, but a bad tree bears bad fruit. A good tree cannot bear bad fruit, and a bad tree cannot bear good fruit. Every tree that does not bear good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire. Thus, by their fruit you will recognize them. Not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but only the one who does the will of my Father who is in heaven. Many will say to me on that day, Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name, and in your name drive out demons, and in your name perform many miracles? Then I will tell them plainly, I never knew you. Away from me, you evildoers. While Jesus warns here about false teachers, false prophets, and false disciples, I want to spend our time in verses 13 and 14. Enter through the narrow gate, for wide is the gate and broad is the road that leads to destruction, and many enter through it. But small is the gate and narrow the road that leads to life, and only a few find it. We face, I think, a significant temptation when we read this text, and that is to take the text out of context, out of the Sermon on the Mount, and treat it like a standalone proverb. And so whenever we face a decision, we want to say, well, what do I do? Do I choose the broad way or the narrow way? And apply it to every circumstance in life. But this verse, this teaching has a context. The image of the gates comes towards the end of the Sermon on the Mount. And we need to make sure that we keep it in that context, how it relates to the passages around it. We also face a temptation to apply this to every decision in life. And like I just said, if we were to go back and think about anger back in chapter 6, and say, how does anger apply to my life? How do I make those choices? Do I choose a broad way or a narrow way? Set chapter 5. But that's not Jesus' point to say that every decision we make is a broad and narrow kind of decision. We also face a temptation to point to any other Christian movement out there and say, well, they're not with us. They are on the broad way, particularly if they have large numbers. Maybe it's a Church of Christ, maybe it's some other church, maybe it's not a church but a Christian organization. And so sometimes we say, well, they are big because if they're big, they must have false teaching, because true teaching only has a narrow gate and a few people that are dedicated enough to do it. And this leads us to a temptation to develop a persecution mentality, to glorify hardships as signs that we are doing things right. To say when we run into opposition, that means we're doing it right. That we are true because there aren't very many of us. And when we adopt that attitude, we encounter in turn the temptation to avoid introspection when our churches aren't growing or when my life is difficult. So rather than considering, could our church be doing things differently? Could we be more active? Could we preach or teach or be involved in our community in a different way that has a greater impact for Jesus? We just say, no, we're small, we're struggling because we're right. And that's what happens when you're right, because broad is the way that leads to destruction. It also on a personal level says, well, if life is difficult, well, then I'm doing things right. I expect to be persecuted because that's what happens to faithful followers of Jesus. But we might just be making a series of really bad decisions. And if we're not willing to spend time examining our choices, examining our hearts and our motives, then we'll miss the point of Jesus' teaching here. Because we need to bear in mind the context that Jesus goes on to say that a good tree will bear good fruit. That is fruit. It multiplies, it grows, it's healthy. Jesus doesn't say that good trees will shrivel up and die. That's one of the differences between a good and a bad tree, is what kind of fruit, a good and a bad Christian, what kind of fruit does it grow? And so these gates, the narrow gate, the broad gate, they are invitations to a journey. At some point in our lives, everyone has to make a decision. Am I willing to become a follower? The number of people not following Jesus has always been greater than the number of people who are following Jesus. So I don't think this is saying, oh, that big church is headed for destruction and the small church is faithful. It's saying that most people will trust their own leadership, their own instincts, their own abilities, or other religions and other ways of thinking that don't include Jesus at all. And the narrow gate, the people who are willing to follow Jesus, is always throughout history been smaller, even when the church was growing in leaps and bounds. And because the number of people not following Jesus is smaller, it means it's a difficult decision. We're going to go against conventional wisdom to follow him, to make that decision to follow him, and then to live in a way that follows his teaching. There's plenty of pressure to leave Jesus on the mountain and we'll head back down, back home, back to our town, our village, our friends, and just get on with life. It was good while it lasted up there on the mountain, but this is where life really happens over here. And so Jesus, as he approaches the end of his sermon, he says, you've got to make a decision now. Just sitting and listening and enjoying the sunshine, hearing the birds chirping, that's not an option. Well, it is an option, but it's not a good one for you. And so as Jesus presents this choice, it's not just a choice of lifestyle, it's not just a choice of make good decisions or bad decisions. It's a choice with consequences that mean that we can't take this lightly. If we're admired Jesus' teaching to this point, we have to decide what to do with it. Do we regard it as truth? And if it's truth, it leads to eternal life. Or do we regard it as something else, something less than truth? And Jesus says that leads to eternal destruction. Jesus himself continues through in his teaching and acknowledges some of the difficulties, some of the barriers that people have to following Jesus. He says sometimes the church will have false teachers. people that look as though they care, people that look as though they're following me and they're spiritual and godly, but really they're wanting to destroy, they're wanting to take money, they're wanting to abuse, they're wanting to knock down what Christ is trying to build up. And he says there are churches and there are leaders in churches that aren't godly despite what they say. He says that's a reality, and there are certainly people today, maybe you have been in situations like that. Likewise, there are people in the church who maybe do great things and say great things and have all the appearance of being a Christian. They may even think they're a Christian themselves, but they've got a lot of stuff in their life they haven't dealt with. They haven't really given their lives over to following Jesus. They're actors, or hypocrites, if you will. They're acting as though they are followers of Jesus, but their hearts are not in it. And people can see that. They look through that facade and they say, why would I become a Christian when I see the way you live in this part of your life or that part of your life? And so these two barriers are significant in making a choice as to which gate am I going to go through. Jesus says, I want you to go through the narrow gate. There's not a lot of people taking that one. Most people are over here. And I know that there'll be leaders that are problematic. I know that there'll be other Christians, other people going through that gate with you or trying to go through that gate with you that just aren't sincere, and they may hurt you and let you down along the way. But he says you have to make this choice. Not whether you'll follow one of those leaders, not whether you're holding hands with that hypocrite, but whether you will follow me, whether you will follow Jesus. That is the invitation. The choice is whether or not we'll start a journey toward new life. And that's challenging. If we were to go back to chapter 5 of the Sermon on the Mount, it begins with the Beatitudes. And those values that we find there are very countercultural. Blessed are the poor in spirit. Blessed are those who mourn. Blessed are the meek. Blessed are the merciful. And it seems as though they're the opposite of what the crowd wants, how they want us to be living. And so it's difficult not just to make a decision to go a different direction, but then to actually live by these new values. However, the point of following Jesus is that we're not traveling alone. That Jesus is with us. His Spirit is within us. That God His presence is with us along the way. And so even though the crowd's over there, that God is over here and that we journey with Him. And so this is why we can't take these verses just as a proverb that stands by itself. They pose a question about Jesus' teaching as a whole and saying, will you follow it? Now, I don't take this invitation lightly, and you shouldn't either. If you've never made a decision to follow Christ, then please take time to talk with someone who has. Take time to talk to a Christian and say, why is your faith important to you? Tell me about it. And tell me how it would be good for me. That's perhaps the most important conversation you can ever have. You can contact me, you can contact someone else that you know and trust and have that conversation. But don't be watching this video, don't be reading the Sermon on the Mount and think, oh, that's nice, or that's good, or that's enjoyable, or that's comforting. The point is to make a choice about which path our life is going to take. Now, some of us have made a decision to follow Jesus, perhaps long ago. And maybe we've fallen into that mindset of, hey, my church isn't growing, but that's okay. That shows that we're faithful. I want to encourage you to keep pushing, keep pressing outward, keep sharing this choice, this decision that Jesus is good. Give people the opportunity to walk through the narrow gate, to start their journey following Jesus. Don't give up on that. And maybe consider and write down even, what are some moments along your journey where you've had to make a conscious decision to do something the Jesus way? Because those moments become stories that encourage others, that lift others up as they're encountering difficulties on their journey. Or maybe some viewers today need to recommit to the journey. That you've sat down in a comfortable place and you've made it through the gate and you're on the road, but you're enjoying the shade, you're enjoying the soft grass or a bench or some place that you've found, and you're not pushing on, you're not moving forward in your journey and following Jesus and continuing to incorporate His teaching and His heart into your life. I've changed enough. This choice of gates is just the beginning. And we need to continue that journey, that progress towards eternal life, which is the destination. The journey is long. And as long as we're breathing, it's never too late to make a decision to recommit to our journey, to our direction, to go back through that narrow gate and move towards eternal life. But the decision has to be made. Just being in the crowd, just being pushed along by the current, being pushed along by the church, being pushed along by family, that will never get us where we want to go. It's a commitment to following Jesus and His Word, His teaching, and growing and being like Him. What's your decision today?